Montana Senator Steve Daines is one of the most powerful senators in the country because he is the chair of a committee that controls all kinds of federal land. That land includes the site where the Washington Commanders and the District of Columbia would like to move forward with RFK Stadium 2.0. It is the site of the current RFK Stadium, which is set to be demolished. And many of the powers that be, many of the parties involved here are ready to move forward with a bill that would set forth a 99-year lease to the District of Columbia to control land that is in the District of Columbia and would be used however the district sees fit. There still needs to be local stuff that would happen to make that into a sports stadium. There's funding mechanisms that need to be voted on. There's debate that needs to happen with the neighborhood. There's other potential uses that are going to be thrown in the mix. But ultimately, it would be on the district to decide what it wants to do with the land. And the senator, a Republican from Montana named Steve Daines, is currently threatening to block said legislation. In his own words from the committee the other day, here is why he says he can't support the current legislation. And actually, first, what he's demanding so that he can.
What I'm demanding here is very straightforward. That the new team leadership and the NFL sit down with the Wetzel family. Sit down with the Blackfeet. Sit down with tribal leaders. And find a way to properly honor the history of the logo and the heritage of our tribal nations, and to rededicate the organization as an advocate for Indian country.
This might surprise some folks, but I actually have some amount of respect for Steve Daines for doing this. Steve Daines is ultimately doing his job. Daines is using the political power that he has acquired by being a longtime senator and ascending to the top of this committee to fight for people that he represents. The Wetzel family, which goes back to the original designer of the original team logo, or the one that was used for 60, 70 years, he wants, the family would like some kind of compensation or recognition or whatever for the design of said logo, and Daines is their senator. And so he is using the power that he has to represent one of his constituents or a group of his constituents. Group either as the family here, or if you want to look at the entirety of the tribe that he is referencing, the Blackfeet tribe. The problem isn't necessarily with Steve Daines, although I find what he's doing incredibly annoying. The problem is with the way the system is set up. And for as much as sports talk about politics, and sometimes we have no choice but to dip into politics, there's one political issue that I have no problem unabashedly talking about politics with on this show. And because I know that despite politics are a third rail often, 99% of you listening right now, in your car radios across the DMV, many of whom either currently or are formerly District of Columbia citizens, are 100% in on DC statehood. Because it's frankly ridiculous that we don't have it. There are nearly 800,000 people in the District of Columbia. That is more than 2 U.S. states. If you want to look at people who actually vote, more people voted in the last presidential election in 2020 in the District of Columbia than a number of U.S. states, including Steve Daines' home state of Montana. So when we talk about representation or taxation without representation, or just flat out not having representation, the fact is Steve Daines gets to represent the Wetzel family and the Blackfeet tribe here, while we don't have anybody stepping up for us. So this is not necessarily a Steve Daines problem. This is a DC should have statehood, DC should have representatives, and I would say even more importantly, Steve Daines shouldn't be able to do this. If the Commanders want to get land in Virginia or Maryland, I'm not even going to talk about the Niners negotiating with California or pick any team that has negotiated a stadium in the last 10 years. the Bills in New York, et cetera, et cetera. If the same team with the same name and the same former name and the same exact everything wants to negotiate with Maryland or Virginia, Steve Daines can't do squad douche. Not a damn thing he can do. So why does he get to do it inside the district? That is, above all else, the problem here. We don't have self-determination, and that's bleeped up. And because the people that would give us said self-determination are the people who get to do this kind of stuff, and we don't have any representation to fight for us beyond Eleanor Holmes Norton, the non-voting member that we send to Congress, who we have on the House side, and we don't have anybody in the Senate. We don't have anybody to advocate for us outside of people who maybe have other things, because obviously, look, we can be adults about this. If DC had 2 senators, they would be Democrats. So there are certainly some Democrats that either for political or they actually think it is like partisan political, or they actually do think it's the right thing, do advocate for DC statehood. But it's nobody's top issue. At times it gets brought up and it's like, oh, it's going to be included. Oh, DC statehood cut out of that bill. We don't have the ability to have people fight. Because at the end of the day, the fact that Steve Daines can do this is the problem, not that Steve Daines is doing it. Because ultimately, he is using his political power to fight for his constituents. And now, is there a separate discussion on the actual matter at hand? Sure. And Steve Daines said why he can't support the legislation currently.
The team can be a beacon of light for these communities, but until I see meaningful actions that satisfy the Wetzel family and other tribal stakeholders, I cannot support this legislation.
And that's crap. Not because it's not a good thing to do, but because it shouldn't be on the burden of the team in Washington, D.C. to be a beacon of light and hope and a representation of whatever Steve Daines and anybody else wants in Montana. Why do we have to deal with this? And again, I think it actually would be good. I actually don't disagree that it would be a good thing for the Washington Commanders, considering they carried the old nickname. And I'm not even making they owe it to it because that name is racist. I'm not getting into that argument. Right? My thoughts on that are well out there. They are well published. They have been very, very clear. And that's actually not the argument I'm here to have today. Again, that is a very complicated, nuanced, and layered argument because there are thousands of native tribes across the United States who don't agree on it. So trying to say what a particular group, which group we should listen to, whatever, like, it's way too complicated. The point I'm trying to make here today is that because the team, even if they did it benevolently to honor native tribes, for years did carry that, in generations, decades, carried that nickname, it would be nice of them to be like, hey, you want to know what? We're not going to forget that heritage. Native people have had a rough time in America since it became the United States of America. Treaties that have not been held up, all kinds of issues with the U.S. government, with people that have taken over their land, et cetera, on down the list of atrocities. And that includes modern day rates of all kinds of, whether it's diseases, poor medical care, like the sexual assault and other crimes that happen to Native peoples are way higher than the national averages. There's a lot to unpack there. And so if we would like to keep Native people and the good that needs to be done for them, considering the circumstances they've been put in by the U.S. government, atop of mind by using a sports team, I got no problem with it. But why does it have to be the team here? Why does a senator from Montana get to decide that the Washington, D.C. team doesn't get to play football where it wants to play because they're not upholding a set of morals or ethics or whatever you want to call the thing that he is desiring? Like, why is that his call? That's the problem here. So I hope that you listening can do what I'm doing here, which is separate multiple things. Whether I like Steve Daines or don't like Steve Daines, whether I agree substantively with his arguments or not, whether I think the old team name is racist or not, whether I think it should still be or we should never use Native American imagery in sports, whether you agree or disagree with any of those things that intersect with this is the point. This is the thing that I hope you take away from the last 12 minutes of radio here. It's not Steve Daines' decision to decide what the football team in Washington, D.C. gets to do with any part of itself. It's just not. Are there roles for government in, making sure that an entity like the NFL stays within certain lines? Of course. Of course. I'm not going to be hypocritical on that and say that, I was fine with them investigating Dan Snyder, but they can't have their hands ever in government when it's something that I disagree with, or in a private business when it's something I disagree with. No. It's the fact that a single senator here, because of his singular role on a single committee, gets to decide something that is far beyond, should be far beyond his purview and far beyond his jurisdiction. That is the issue here. The rest of the stuff, we can argue about that another day. Or not. We can just talk about the OTAs and the schedule and the football.
This is the Hoffman Show on the T980 and the Odyssey app.